Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Parsha is Pinchas. The mourning period commemorating the fall of the first and second Jewish commonwealth reminds us of the divisive nature of zealotry. And it is zealotry that lies behind the story of Pinchas taking the law into his own impulsive hands. The Pinchas model was problematic to the rabbis and has been used by zealots until today to justify vigilantism and extrajudicial activities. So join us for Vigilant against Vigilantism. Well, Rabbi, welcome to another episode of Madlik. We're in the 3 weeks, so we're starting to think about the cause of the destruction of the temple, the loss of our commonwealth, and obviously we're in a very critical moment in the history of the third commonwealth now. So everything is old and new at the same time. There were so many things we could have talked about this week. We have a president, a sitting president, who did a Moses speech. I've been to the mountaintop. I think you're going to talk about that in shul, but we're going to talk about Pinchas.
Great. Pinchas is a great topic. We might as well start right at the beginning of the parsha.
So it's funny that you say we begin at the beginning of the Parsha, because, who am I to criticize? But this Parsha is called Pinchas, but you got to go back into last week's Parsha to get the beginning of the story. I don't know who was in charge of cutting up the Parshiyot. We have discussed that before. But right. Our Parsha only begins...
They didn't do a good job.
Well, they just want us to, keep on our toes. So in Numbers 25:6, it said, "Just then a certain Israelite man came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a spear in hand, he followed the Israelite man into the bedroom, stabbing both the Israelite man and the Midianite women while they were fornicating." I added that. "The Israelite man and the woman through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was checked. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. That is the end of last week's Parsha. This week's Parsha we begin. God spoke to Moses saying, "Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, b'keno et kinati b'tocham, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Say therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites." So we have a situation where there is a public display in the front of the congregation, in the front of Moses, of an Israelite man sinning bifarhesia, which means in open. And they're all standing there, they're weeping, Moses' mouth is agape, and all of a sudden, this guy Pinchas, v'yakum betocha eda, he gets up in the middle of the congregation, v'yikach v'mach biado, and he takes a spear in his hand. And if you go to Rashi following the traditional commentaries says, he saw what was being done, and he was thereby reminded of the law on this subject. He said to Moses, "I have received a tradition from you. He who has intercourse with an Aramean heathen woman, zealous people may attack him. Kinaim pogin bo." He replied to him, Moses replied to Pinchas, "Let him who reads the letter be the agent for executing it." He said, "You remember the law, you go ahead and carry it out." Now, in one of the articles in the Sefaria source sheet from thetorah.com, the commentary says the act itself is a halacha from God of Moses at Sinai. So according to the texts, this law of Kinaim Pogim Ba, that a zealot can go ahead in the moment of the crime, in the moment of feeling he has to protect God's name. That is a halacha l'Moshe Messinai. And the only reason Pinchas carried it out rather than Moses was because Moses forgot and then granted his people the honors since he remembered. Now, I'm not sure he reads that into the text that Moses forgot. It's certainly kind of implied. And as a segue, this is another instance besides that famous Rabbi Akiva story where Moses does not realize a halacha l'Moshe Messinai. He does it. The rabbis were just.
So what I would say here is, of course, that it's not Moses forgot, but Moses is not in a position of leadership anymore after he hit the rock, and therefore it's the next generation who comes.
I think that's a wonderful and very timely interpretation given the week. And you're right. You're going to talk about succession later, but maybe what you're saying is, even at this moment, Moses is stepping back and say, "Hey, Kamala, you take over from here, so to speak." I love that.
Now, I just want to say one thing. We should just notice about Pinchas. Pinchas is not the second generation. Pinchas is the third generation. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen. He's the grandson of Aaron the high priest. So actually, it's really striking because sometimes it skips over to the third generation. You know, transition isn't always simple. It's like transition in a business, right? Sometimes it goes to the son, and sometimes the son's not up to it, so it goes to the grandson. So you see it here; it's going to the grandson, not the son.
That is fascinating as well. So the bottom line is that in the text of the Torah itself, it uses this word "vikano et kinati." You have this zealotry for my zealousness, so to speak. The rabbinic dictum is "knaim pogim ba." Knaim, he who is zealous, can attack the criminal. And literally, as I said in the introduction, the simple meaning of how this text has been taken is this is a space within our legal tradition for extrajudicial activities, for vigilantism, so to speak. And the first time, it could have just gathered dust in the drawer, but we see already in the book of Maccabees that when Matthias saw that a fellow Jew, by the way, was giving a sacrifice, a forbidden sacrifice, he gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and he killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. In Maccabees 1:2-26, thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Pinchas did against Zimri, son of Salo. So already in the book of Maccabees, that this Pinchas model was taken as an example of when you can take the law into your own hand in a positive way. Very fascinating for a tradition that is so legalistic and values process so much. This is a kind of a very dangerous space.
Very dangerous space. I mean, that's why this is so striking. So basically, the Torah only addresses situations between Jews and other Jews. Like the Ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you should love your neighbor as yourself. Doesn't mean you shouldn't like non-Jews, but the Torah addresses other Jews. And here too, the Torah doesn't talk about fornicating with non-Jews. That's not addressed by the Torah. So therefore, that's why there's room here for Pinchas to do something which isn't explicitly mentioned.
Okay. I think that's a fascinating insight. It struck me as interesting that in the case of Matisyahu in the Maccabees, it was actually, he killed both a Jew and and an official of the Hasmonean government. It seems to me, and I think we're going to see this a little bit in the texts, that actually the ruling, had it gone to a court, might be different than the ruling of the moment. And that's why I say this is kind of like, you'll see in our commentaries, in our exploration, that it's very important that whoever does this zealot, this kinaim, is truly a kinaim. He has to be in the moment at that time. So if you go, for instance, to Sanhedrin 82, Rav Chisda says, concerning one who comes to consult with the court when he sees a Jewish man engaging in intercourse with a Gentile, the court does not instruct him that he is permitted to kill the transgressor. It was also stated that Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan says the court does not instruct him that it is permitted to kill. So what's fascinating is in a sense you might be right, because what the court is saying is you don't have the right to do anything at all. But certainly this is what we call extrajudicial. And it's fascinating what the Talmud, how it recounts. It always fills in the void of the narrative. It says, the Gemara asks, what did Pinchas see that led him to arise and take action? Rav says he saw the incident taking place before him and he remembered the halacha. This is kind of what Rashi quoted. He said to Moses, brother of the father of my father, so there you go, 3 generations, as Moses was the brother of his grandfather Aaron, did you not teach me this during your descent from Mount Sinai? One who engages in this type of a crime. And Moses said to him, let the one who reads the letter be the agent to fulfill it. And Shmuel says Pinchas saw and considered the meaning of the verse, and he went on and he said, anywhere that there is desecration of the Lord's name, one does not show respect to the teacher. So now the rabbis are already starting to needle it and coax out a backstory, that here he is, how dare he come up with a law in front of Moses. Let's forget for a second that he says it's a halacha l'Moshe Messinai, or that Moses told it to him, but he's adjudicating in front of the master. In those situations, one need not consult his teacher, but must immediately proceed to right the wrong. Therefore, he took the spear and took immediate action. Rabbi Yitzchak says that Rabbi Eliezer says he saw that an angel came down. So it goes on to say that he basically stopped the plague, and that's in a sense why he's considered a hero here. The interesting thing is that I found a commentary called Ben Yehoyada, who comes up with a fascinating diuk, a fascinating kind of a look at the minutiae of the text here. And even though we say it's a halacha l'Moshe Messinai, what the Ben Yehuda says is, notice that it says, you taught me. He doesn't say you taught us. And so what he's saying is, remember Moses, when you came down from Sinai, you called me Pinchas aside, and you say, Pinchas, in a situation like this is what you have to do, or maybe what you're destined to do. But we're starting to see a sense here that the rabbis are not only saying if you went to court, you wouldn't be doing this. Now they're saying that Moses forgot about it, or as you say, Moses wasn't willing to adjudicate. They're saying that it was a law passed down by Moses, but maybe only to this Pinchas, and maybe you could make the case only for Pinchas, or only for this moment. It's clear, and we're going to see it clearer as we progress, that the rabbis were troubled with this, and the rabbis were trying to limit it, minimize how it could potentially become a template for future action. Before I ask you to comment, let's just go to the Jerusalem Talmud's version of this. And it says, again, what did he see? He understood and happened to practice. It was stated not with the agreement of the sages. So the Jerusalem Talmud adds two phrases. It says, Shelo kuratzon chachamim, upinchas shelo kuratzon chachamim. That this whole incident was not with the blessing, was not in accordance with what the rabbis would have wanted. Kind of amazing if you think about it. And Pinchas was not the rabbi's guy. They did not put him on a soapbox. This is radical, is it not, Rabbi?
I mean, the whole thing is radical. Pinchas kills people even though he's not following a law in the Torah. If that happened today, there would be protests everywhere. Can you imagine? Right? Means there's a law and he didn't follow the law. The Torah doesn't say anything about fornicating between a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman. And Pinchas took the law into his own hands. We wouldn't allow that today. So you understand the fact that the rabbis are troubled by this. It makes total sense to me.
So the Jerusalem Talmud goes even further. If you remember in the pasuk, it says "V'yakom mitoch ha'edah," that Pinchas got up from the assembly. The rabbis in the Jerusalem Talmud says "Omad Pinchas mitoch Sanhedrin shelo." So now, instead of having this kind of impulsive act of Pinchas, they are drawing out the narrative of what happened as Moses and Pinchas are looking and having this discussion. So initially we considered maybe they were just standing two isolated individuals discussing this. Moses doesn't remember the law that he brought down. Pinchas does. Now all of a sudden we have a convocation of the Sanhedrin. They're discussing it in the Sanhedrin, and this Pinchas gets up and say, enough with this deliberation and a legal proceeding. I'm going to go out and do what needs to be done. It almost reminds you a little bit of Nachshon and Moses is kind of praying. These are two impulsive characters, but the ramifications between the two are totally different, obviously.
Right. It's one thing to jump into the sea. It's another thing to kill somebody.
So when the Jerusalem Talmud says that the rabbis were not with him, I mean, that is kind of profound. The Torah.com article that I quote also has the Targum Yonatan, who also just translates the verse as saying he arose among his Sanhedrin. So if you can imagine, we all of a sudden have this dichotomy. On the one hand, the rabbis say, if you come to a Besdin, which is a modern-day Sanhedrin, we were told you don't do this. So it's almost as though he left the Beis Medrash and he went and did this thing. The whole direction of the rabbis, if you look into Mishnah Torah written by Maimonides, and he talks about this law, he says the zealous person can strike the sinners only at the moment of the sin, as is the case with Zimri. If, however, the sinner withdraws, it's a moment after the sin was committed, he should not be slain. Indeed, if the zealot slays him, he may be executed as a murderer. If you don't carry this out exactly right, that vigilante can be prosecuted and actually killed for killing another human being. If the zealous person comes to ask permission from the court to slay him, they do not instruct him, even if this takes place at the time of the relation. So now he's getting back to that sense of where the Sanhedrin is meeting. Not only that, writes Maimonides, if the zealous person comes to kill the transgressor, and he withdraws and kills the zealous person. So now we have a similar law coming into effect. If I get attacked, if there's a rodef coming after me, I'm allowed to kill on the spot the person who's coming to kill me. So what happens if this zealot, this Pinchas, attacks the sinner 5 seconds after the sin has already been committed? It's not in the moment, or he tries to kill him, and the sinner turns around and kills the zealot. The sinner who kills the zealot is protected under the law of the rodef. They are really really minimizing this moment, this window of opportunity to carry this law. It almost, Rabbi, smacks of the Ben Soreh and Morer, the rebellious son that the rabbis say it's so constrained that it's almost there more as a kind of a principle or a pedagogic point than actually happening in real life. What's your thinking about this?
So I think you're right. I think they're trying to narrow it. But let me say something else. You have a problem here because you have a law that isn't anywhere, right? He takes the law into his own hands. The rabbis don't like that. So you know what they do? They create a whole set of laws around what Pinchas does because that's the way they deal with situations is they turn it into law. So all of a sudden, Pinchas wasn't just doing something that was, that was outside of a legal system. It was part of the legal system. And what Pinchas did, but the legal system doesn't allow for it. So by limiting it, it says the legal system allowed this, but only this. And that's what you quoted the Ben Yehoyada as saying that Moses taught this specifically to Pinchas. This is not a rule for everyone.
And the rabbis clearly understood the ramifications and how this could be misused. The Torah Tamima says as following. He says, it is impossible to give permission to just any person who has the right to harm such a person because who knows? Maybe he is doing it with some ulterior motive and saying that he is doing it in the spirit of God jealousy. And in the meantime, he is killing a soul that is not obligated to die by the law himself. The ability to misuse this law and to come into court and say, yeah, I just killed this guy because the passion, the zealotry of God came over me. This smacks of covering up a mob hit or covering up a political vendetta. Clearly, it's a fascinating instance where, and the Yerushalmi said it, they didn't like Pinchas. They didn't like this rule. I mean, here you have the rabbis against something that is literally written in the Torah that in the Jerusalem Talmud, they actually say what's behind their thinking. They just didn't like it. But everywhere else, they are diminishing it, constraining it, contracting it. Just absolutely fascinating because it shows you the power of the rabbis in a good way. It shows you that they were truly committed to the rule of law, that they were truly committed to applying the law universally, that everybody gets judged the same. And this really cut against their project.
I think that's absolutely right. This is fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating to study the Talmud and the Yerushalmi and to see the way they're struggling, and that's what they're struggling with. If you have a legal system, for someone to work outside of the legal system is literally a crisis.
It's also kind of fascinating how they were imagining it, because after you read all of the rabbis, you start to imagine it differently. And, I just got back from Europe, and we're used to seeing paintings of biblical scenes that look like they were painted in Europe, They just assumed. So you have the Midrash Tanchuma. Everybody is focused on how Pinchas got up and he took a sword and he left. There's one Midrash that says he had to get up and leave the Beit Midrash because you're not allowed to have a kli neshech. You're not allowed to have a sword in the Beis Medrash. So these rabbis are looking at this scene in the desert and they're assuming that you got the Mir Yeshiva, you got the Slobodka Yeshiva. He gets up from the Beis Medrash and in Midrash Tanchuma, it says, Ela shahayu nosim v'notnim b'davar im hu chayav mita olo. This is, they looking at this discussion between Moses and Pinchas. It's simply that while they were involved in the give and take on the matter of whether or not the culprit was liable for death, they recast it in their own terms, in their own eyes. And they were not willing to let it go from the Beit Medrash. They were not willing to let it go from the rule of law in the Sanhedrin. Just so fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating. This is great material. Absolutely great material. The phrase that they use is kanaim pokimbo, which is zealots take revenge in this kind of case. It's a very strong language, but it's also a very non-legal language, right? That's not the way you talk about law, right? If you think about the American legal system, you imagine someone telling you that's the law. Zealots take control of the situation. You talk about political violence. There was an assassination attempt against Trump. You say zealots take things into their own hands. That's crazy. We don't operate that way. We can't have a system working that way.
I started by saying we're in the 3 weeks, and the famous episode that kind of one focuses on when one looks at the birth of rabbinic Judaism is that moment where they smuggle Yochanan ben Zakkai out of the sieged Jerusalem. And who are they smuggling him out against? They're smuggling him out against zealots who want us all to either stand together or die together. And what's coming out of this discussion of Pinchas is not only is it a conflict between extrajudicial and judicial, it's a conflict between learning, study, intellectual approaches to our laws and our religion, and the zealots are coming out as not only impulsive but anti-intellectual. So you had that in Yochanan ben Zakkai because he got smuggled out and he said, "Tein li Yavna v'chachamecha," give me Yavna and its scholars, and ergo was the birth of rabbinic Judaism. But you have kind of a sense of that here as well, where they're really by interjecting the Sanhedrin, the give and take of Talmudic discussion of the Beit Midrash into this discussion, is they're disposing Pinchas on the one hand, the zealot who is not following his mind, he's not following tradition, he's not following authority. Religious or legal authority. That's how they're putting this in contradistinction to each other. And you can even say they did the same treatment for the Maccabees, where they hardly celebrated the military victory. They certainly didn't celebrate what we read about, where Matisyahu actually killed Jews who were not being filial to the tradition. They talked about a vial of oil. You really see something very strong about what the rabbis were doing here, and that makes it all the more fascinating.
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. I mean, you learn from all of these sources kind of the rabbinic agenda, how important the legal system was, and how afraid they were of doing something outside of that.
So I want to bring it up to the present. This week, Ben Gvir went to the Har HaBayit. This is a typical way of instigating trouble, of creating friction. It comes right out of the playbook of the zealots. There were certain rabbis, and we've discussed this in past episodes, who say you're not even allowed to be there. But it's this idea of pushing the needle forward. And I came across an article. It's actually a scholarly rendering, and it's all about a Yitzchak Feivish Ginsburg. And he is a Chabad or ex-Chabad rabbi who literally is surrounded by the Hill youth, by many Jews who are new to Judaism, Bala Tshuvot. And what he argues, and price tag is one of the things that he encourages. He has scholarly works that justify Baruch Ginsburg killing those Muslims in the Kever HaMachpelah. What he is arguing, it's not a coincidence that many of his followers are dropouts from the yeshiva. It's not a tick in the software. It's part of the program. And if you look at the notes, it writes about what he's saying. He's trying to almost picture himself as the Hasidic masters like the Baal Shem Tov, who attracted the simple Jews and gave them joy and gave them honor. Here he's taking the these disaffected youth, and he's saying, you don't need learning. You don't need to go to the Beit Midrash. That will only cloud your mind. You need to be zealots. You need to go ahead and take revenge when revenge needs to be taken. It is a very scary model, and it's a model that we have to look at during these weeks more carefully than we do, because ultimately we lost the first and the second Jewish commonwealth because of this misapplication of a Pinchas type of approach. Whether it was ever had an appropriate moment of application, I don't know, but certainly he is providing it almost as a strategy and a marching orders for the masses, not for the individuals. It's fascinating reading. I encourage you all to look at it.
I'll just say that that is fascinating. And you see how anti-rabbinic it is. The rabbis worked so hard to put Pinchas in a rabbinic legal context. And what Rabbi Ginsburg does is he's proud of the fact that Pinchas is outside the legal context, and therefore he says that that's a model for working outside the.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, so it's a wonderful parsha. Think about it in terms of secession also, and that's where that comes later in the parsha. But in terms of Pinchas, as we enter the 3 weeks and we look at the current situation in Israel, I think it is very important that we understand that we Jews have a propensity to have factions, to have zealots, to have those who want to take the Torah and mold it into their vision, and we have to be vigilant. We at Madlik definitely have to be vigilant. The last thing that I'll end with on a very positive note is that Pinchas at the end of the day came from the same tribe as Levi and Dinah. They had this vigilante sense inside of them, and the blessing that they gave in Bamidbar Rabbah, it says, therefore say, behold, I am giving him my covenant of peace. It has the most beautiful rendering of peace that they blessed Pinchas and the tribe of Levi with. And I think that, in a sense, the antidote for what Pinchas did or what he had to do at that moment was the rabbis go ahead and he gave to Pinchas, as the world is conducted only through peace, and the Torah in its entirety is in peace. If a person comes from the road, one greets him with peace. Likewise, in the morning, one greets him with peace, and at night, likewise, one greets with peace. Shema Yisrael concludes with the blessing, spread over us a canopy of peace. It has this most beautiful homage to peace that it gives to Pinchas at the end of the day. And I think that is ultimately what we need to be inspired by, and to ensure that the third commonwealth stays strong.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. Shabbat shalom to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Shabbat shalom.